The room was already tense before the cameras even rolled. Reporters shuffled papers, microphones clicked on, and the cold glow of lights washed over the podium where Senator John Kennedy stood, calm, unbothered, almost amused. If there was one thing Washington had learned about him, it was this. He walked into chaos like a man strolling into a Sunday grocery store. But no one expected this moment. And it all began with a reporter who thought she had the perfect got-you question. It started harmless. Soft tone, polite smile, the kind of opening that makes everyone lean in because they know something sharp is hiding underneath. "Senator," she said, raising her voice just enough to quiet the room, "given your recent comments, do you believe your approach is outdated? Some would say it harms progress." People turned. Pens froze. Even the crew behind the cameras blinked, waiting for his reaction. Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a reporter a small, almost fatherly nod. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for question." Not sarcastic, not dismissive, just calm, too calm. And that's when the room sensed it. This wasn't gratitude. This was the warm smile before the storm. He placed both hands lightly on the podium, leaning forward just enough to show he wasn't dodging anything. His voice dropped into that slow Louisiana drawl that could make even the sharpest criticism sound like a bedtime story. "I appreciate you asking that," he continued, "because it tells me you're listening. But let me explain something in a way that might help all of us today." The entire press room held its breath. His answer didn't begin with anger. It didn't begin with defensiveness. Instead, it began with a story, a simple one. He talked about a judge he once knew, a man who believed progress didn't mean rushing forward blindly, but making decisions by looking at the facts, not the feelings. A man who said, if you build a house without checking the foundation, the house will fall, no matter how modern the design. Then Kennedy connected it smoothly to the reporter's question. "Calling something outdated doesn't make it wrong," he said softly, "and calling something modern doesn't make it right. Progress isn't about speed, it's about direction." A few reporters exchanged looks. Not hostile ones, surprised ones. This wasn't the got-you moment they expected. This was a lesson disguised as an answer. The reporter tried to interject. Just one more follow-up. But Kennedy lifted a hand gently, respectfully, as if guiding her through her own point. "I hear what you're trying to say," he told her, "but allow me to finish the thought so I can answer you fully. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't confrontation. It was control, quiet, steady, and undeniably commanding." Then, without raising his voice, he shifted into the argument she wasn't prepared for. He explained the policy, the reasoning behind it, the numbers that supported it, and the public feedback that had shaped it. What began as her attempt to corner him turned into him calmly laying out the entire structure of his position, point by point, brick by brick, until the argument she tried to build simply collapsed under its own weight. By the time he finished, the reporter just nodded. She didn't argue back. She didn't try a second ambush. She simply said, "Thank you, Senator." And he replied with that same calm tone, "You're welcome, ma'am. Always happy to clarify." The room erupted, not into applause, but into stunned murmurs. He hadn't attacked her. He hadn't humiliated her. He had simply thanked her, then dismantled her argument piece by piece. And no one in the room would forget how gently and completely he did it. The press room didn't return to normal after that first exchange. If anything, the air thickened, as if everyone realized they had just witnessed the warm-up, not the finale. Cameras zoomed in tighter. Reporters straightened in their seats. People who thought they were scrolling on their phones suddenly put them down. Because after the reporter sat down, quiet, embarrassed but not offended, something unexpected happened. Senator Kennedy didn't move on. He paused, scanned the room, and said something that made the second row freeze mid-breath. "Now, before we take the next question, let me add one more thing, because clarity is important." Those words, clarity is important, are Kennedy's version of rolling up his sleeves. He wasn't lecturing. He wasn't scolding. He was simply making sure the public wasn't left with half a story. He began by repeating the reporter's original question, not the way she worded it, but the way the public might have misunderstood it. Slowly, plainly, almost like he was teaching class. And for a moment, the entire room felt less like a press conference and more like a masterclass in controlled communication. When someone says an idea is outdated, he explained, the first thing we should ask is, compare to what? Compare to chaos? Compare to guesswork? Compare to decisions that sound good, but don't hold up when you lift the hood. Some reporters scribbled faster. A few smirked, realizing he wasn't just offending himself. He was guiding the narrative before anyone else had a chance to twist it. Then he leaned back from the podium, letting his hands rest calmly on either side. "Let me tell y'all something," he said, in that calm Southern cadence that could make even a warning sound like a friendly dinner conversation. A country doesn't move forward by assuming disagreement is the same as destruction. Debate is healthy. Sloppy thinking is not. The room reacted. Not loudly, just tiny chuckles, raised eyebrows, and a quiet, shared understanding that this was the line people would quote later. But he hadn't aimed it at the reporter. Not once did he insult her. Not once did he question her intelligence, motives, or professionalism. This was broader, bigger than her question. A message framed for the entire audience, those in the room and those watching at home. And then came the moment that shifted the whole energy. The reporter who had asked the first question, still holding her notes, slowly raised her hand again. A small gesture, hesitant, almost apologetic. She wasn't trying to challenge him anymore. She was trying to understand. "Senator," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that the criticism comes from misunderstanding, not disagreement?" Kennedy nodded once, not triumphantly, just gently, "Exactly. And thank you for asking that follow-up." It was the second time he had thanked her. But this time, instead of setting up the dismantling of an argument, he used the moment to build a bridge. "If you disagree with me," he continued, "that's democracy. If you're confused about why I support something, that's an invitation. But when people criticize without knowing the facts, that's when the conversation stops helping anybody." The room shifted again, this time toward him. People leaned forward. They weren't watching a confrontation anymore. They were watching a conversation evolve into something constructive. The reporter lowered her hand, not in defeat, but in respect. Everyone noticed. So did Kennedy. That simple exchange, that calm redirection, was how he took control of the narrative without raising his voice, without shaming anyone, and without turning a disagreement into a battle. And every reporter in that room realized the same thing. He didn't just answer the question. He reframed the whole discussion. By now, every reporter sensed a shift. The room no longer felt like a press conference. It felt like an arena where one man, armed only with calm logic, had quietly taken center stage. But in every room, there's always one person who thinks they can turn the tide back. And that person sat in the third row, tapping a pen against her notebook like a warning signal. She didn't wait for the moderator. She didn't raise her hand politely. She simply stood. "Senator Kennedy," she said sharply, "with all due respect, your explanation sounds polished. But critics argue that you're avoiding accountability. How do you respond to claims that your stance is more about appearances than substance?" The room tensed again, not because the question was harsh. It wasn't. But because it was clearly crafted to provoke. A spark tossed toward a pile of dry leaves. But Kennedy didn't burn. He didn't even warm. Instead, he looked at her the way a professor looks at a student who asked the wrong question, but in the right spirit. Calm, steady, encouraging clarity. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for standing up to ask that." Third time he said it. 3 questions. 3 thank yous. He wasn't just answering. He was setting a tone. He continued, "Accountability is measured by facts, not by feelings about how those facts are presented. So let's start with the facts." He reached into the stack of documents beside him, not dramatic, not rehearsed, and lifted just one page, a single sheet, a summary. He held it out so cameras could catch the header. "These are the results of the oversight review conducted last month, publicly available, transparent, independent." A ripple went through the room. Reporters knew what that meant. No wiggle room, no vague wording, no speculative gaps to stretch into narratives. Kennedy tapped the paper lightly. "This review didn't evaluate my presentation. It evaluated the policy itself. He paused. Now let's look at the findings. He read only 3 lines. Clear, plain, nonpartisan. And with each line, the reporter's confidence faded a little more. Not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't prepared for a point-by-point answer backed by documents instead of rhetoric. She tried to cut in again. But aren't there still unanswered? Kennedy gently raised a hand. Let me finish the thought, ma'am. Then I'll address your concern. It wasn't dominance. It was structure, a reminder that clarity comes one sentence at a time. He continued. The review found the policy effective. It found no misuse. And it recommended expanding the very approach that critics claim is all appearance. The room went silent again. Kennedy then set the paper down and looked directly at her, not harshly, not dismissively, but firmly. So, to answer your question, appearances don't matter here. Results do, and the results speak louder than any criticism based on assumptions. No theatrics, no raised voice, just context. The reporter, still standing, slowly lowered her pen. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't embarrassed. She simply realized something. He came prepared to answer, clarify, and dismantle confusion without turning anyone into a villain. Finally, Kennedy added, if you have a follow-up rooted in the data, I'm happy to address it. If it's based on speculation alone, I'll respectfully say it's best we stick to what we can verify. A soft murmur swept the room. A line had been drawn, not between the senator and the press, but between facts and assumptions. And the second reporter, the one who thought she could ignite the fire, sat down quietly with nothing more to add. In a single exchange, Kennedy showed that confidence doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from preparation. After the second reporter sat down, the entire room felt different. Quieter, more focused, almost reverent. What started as a typical press conference had shifted into something else entirely. Kennedy was no longer reacting to questions. He was steering the entire conversation, and everyone in the room knew it. The moderator scanned the list, but before he could speak, Kennedy gently gestured for him to wait. I'd like to address something before we take another question, he said, voice steady but carrying enough weight to pull every eye forward. This was unusual. Senators rarely interrupt their own press conferences, but the room stayed silent, not because they were afraid to speak, but because they sensed he was about to widen the lens, zooming out from individual questions to the bigger picture they were all missing. I want to make sure we don't confuse disagreement with dysfunction, he began. Some folks think that when reporters challenge me, it's a sign of conflict, but I see it differently. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Not too long, just enough to build gravity. It means we're working. Some reporters blinked, surprised by the unexpected direction. Kennedy continued, y'all have a job, to question power, and I have a job, to answer those questions honestly, with facts, not frustration. It was a line that took the tension and turned it into mutual respect. Even a few cameras shook slightly as videographers adjusted their grip, suddenly paying closer attention. Then he said something that changed the tone completely. Let me be clear. I don't want easy questions. Easy questions don't help the American people. A ripple moved across the room. This was not the response a politician usually gives. Most dodge hard questions. Most hide behind talking points. Kennedy? He was inviting them. But, he added, holding up a finger gently, hard questions have to be grounded in reality. If they're built on assumptions instead of evidence, we're no longer informing the public. We're entertaining them. And that's not your purpose, nor mine. It was a subtle challenge, not to a person, but to the standard. The third-row reporter who had spoken earlier shifted in her seat. The first reporter, the one who started everything, looked back down at her notebook, replaying his words. Then Kennedy did something that surprised everyone. He stepped away from the podium entirely. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just 2 slow steps to the side, hands clasped loosely in front of him, as if he were talking to the room one-on-one. I've been in Washington long enough to know that arguments get louder when the truth gets quieter, he said. But today y'all haven't made noise. You've made points. And I respect that. A few heads raised. Compliments from politicians are rare. Genuine ones, even rarer. Then he finished. So let's do this right. For the next few questions, I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to explain, clarify, and if I'm wrong in something, correct it. That's what accountability actually looks like. And there it was, the turning point. The exact moment the press realized Kennedy wasn't fencing with them. He wasn't dodging. He wasn't counterattacking. He was inviting a real conversation, open, structured, fact-driven. For the first time since the conference began, the reporters weren't preparing ambush questions. They were preparing thoughtful ones, not because they feared him, but because he had earned their seriousness. And as the moderator finally cleared his throat to call on the next reporter, the room understood the shift completely. Senator John Kennedy wasn't playing defense anymore. He was leading the room, without ever raising his voice. The next reporter stood slowly, almost cautiously, like someone approaching a wild horse, unsure whether it would run or bow its head. He adjusted his tie, looked down at his notes, then glanced up at Kennedy. "Senator," he began, "you've spoken a lot about clarity and accountability today. But some critics argue that your approach oversimplifies complex issues. They say you reduce problems to one-liners. How do you respond to that?" The room tensed again. This wasn't a hostile question, but it was a test, a subtle one, a test of patience, a test of consistency, a test of whether Kennedy could keep the same steady tone when someone questioned not his policy, but his style. Kennedy didn't return to the podium. He stayed where he stood, just to the side, hands still clasped, posture relaxed like a man having a conversation in his living room. "Thank you," he said, offering the reporter a nod. "That's a fair question." A fair question. He didn't call it wrong. He didn't call it biased. He acknowledged it without hesitation. Then he took a slow breath, one of those long, measured ones he used when shifting from conversation to principle. "Let me explain something," he said. "If a problem can't be explained simply, then the people governing the country probably don't understand it well enough themselves." The reporter blinked. Some pens stuttered. A few eyebrows shot up, not because the line was sharp, but because it was true, and everyone knew it. Kennedy continued, pacing gently, not in agitation, but in reflection. "Now, I may put things plainly. That's my way. But I never ignore complexity. I simplify only after I've studied every part of the issue, after I've read the data, consulted the experts, and reviewed the consequences." He tapped the folder on the podium, without even looking at it. Clarity is not the enemy of complexity. Confusion is. The room softened, leaning into the explanation. Even the reporter who asked the question seemed to relax his shoulders. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a storyteller's confidence. "You see, when folks hear a complicated issue explained in complicated language, they assume the speaker is smart. When they hear the same issue explained clearly, they assume the problem is simple." He tilted his head slightly. Neither assumption is correct. A quiet wave of murmurs rolled through the room. He went on, "My job isn't to impress people with big words. My job is to make sure every American, whether they're a professor or a plumber, understands what's happening in their government." He paused just long enough to let the message land. "If someone calls that oversimplifying, then I'll wear that label proudly." For the first time since he began speaking, a few reporters exchanged small smiles, not mocking ones, but the kind that appear when someone recognizes sincerity. Then, with his signature measured calmness, Kennedy addressed the heart of the reporter's question. Complexity matters. Context matters. But access matters even more. A democracy cannot function if the public is kept in the dark behind technical terms and political jargon. The reporter raised his hand gently. "So, you believe clarity is part of accountability?" Kennedy's reply was instant. "It is accountability." His tone stayed gentle. His posture stayed relaxed. But his conviction cut through the room like a beam of light. And in that moment, everyone realized something profound. This wasn't about winning a press exchange. This wasn't about looking clever or avoiding criticism. This was Kennedy's philosophy, laid bare, simple, grounded, unshakable. The moderator looked around, startled by how quiet the room had become. Kennedy gave one small nod and stepped back toward the podium. "Next question," he said softly. And the room, now transformed, leaned in once more to be why now. The reporters weren't just listening. They were absorbing. Something had changed, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, until it became undeniable. The room wasn't against him anymore. They weren't trying to corner him, expose him, or challenge him just to score a clip. They were learning. The moderator called on a reporter in the far left aisle. She stood slowly, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Senator," she began, her voice surprisingly soft, "I want to circle back to something you said a moment ago about accountability. You mentioned correcting yourself if you're wrong. Could you give an example of a time you changed your position based on new information?" This was a trap for most politicians. A chance to admit fault. A risky moment if handled without care. But Kennedy, he smiled. Not a smirk. Not a politician's stage smile. A genuine, appreciative smile, like someone relieved to finally be asked a question that matters. "That's an excellent question," he said. "And yes, I can." The room grew still. Pens lifted. Cameras zoomed. You could almost hear the electricity shift. He rested one hand on the podium, not gripping, just touching it lightly. "There was a bill a few years back," he said. "One I supported early on. It was marketed as a measure to expand rural infrastructure. Looked great on paper. Tight language. Good intent." He looked across the room, making eye contact with several small clusters of reporters. "But then," he continued, "I dug deeper. I read the technical assessments, the financial breakdowns, the long-term projections, and I realized something." He held up one finger. "It helped rural areas, but hurt small local businesses." Second finger. "It boosted one industry while quietly undercutting another." Third finger. "And it created a 5-year burden that taxpayers didn't deserve." He lowered his hand. "So I changed my position." The reporter blinked, surprised at how plainly he said it. He continued, "People think changing your mind is weakness. But in public service, it's necessary. Because if the facts change, or if you learn something you know before, you owe it to the people you serve to adjust." A wave of quiet agreement rippled across the room. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't posture. He didn't turn the moment into a lecture. He simply told the truth, with humility, not theatrics. "Now," he said, "I know some folks will say I flip-flopped. They're welcome to call it that. I call it learning." The reporter followed up, no hostility in her tone, just curiosity. "So you believe changing your mind publicly builds trust?" Kennedy nodded. "Only when you explain why you changed it. People don't lose trust because you corrected yourself. They lose trust when you pretend you were always right." That landed harder than any dramatic confrontation could have. A few reporters, almost involuntarily, nodded along. One even whispered to another, "He's right." Kennedy wasn't dominating the room. He was influencing it. Quietly, respectfully, unmistakably. Then something subtle but monumental happened. The reporter who initially challenged him, the very first one, raised her hand again. Her voice was different now. Softer, thoughtful. "Senator, thank you for being transparent about that. I think our viewers will appreciate hearing it." He looked at her with the same unwavering calmness he'd shown from beginning. "You're welcome," he said. No sarcasm, no edge, just respect. And in that moment, the narrative flipped completely. He was no longer the senator being grilled by the press. He was a steady voice guiding a room full of people who, despite their differences, were now aligned in one rare, fragile thing: understanding. The storm had passed, but the transformation was far from over. By the time the moderator announced the final question, the room felt completely different from how it began. The tension, the suspicion, the eagerness to catch him slipping, all of it had melted away, replaced by a calm curiosity. Even the cameras seemed to hum quieter. The last reporter chosen stood at the far end of the room, a younger journalist who looked both nervous and determined. He cleared his throat, gripping his notepad tightly. Senator Kennedy, he began, after everything discussed today, the disagreements, the clarifications, the explanations, what do you want the public to take away from this press conference? What's the one thing you hope people understand? It wasn't challenge. It wasn't attack. It was something far more powerful. An honest question seeking an honest answer. Kennedy didn't return to the podium right away. Instead, he took a slow step back, looked around the room, and let the weight of the moment settle. Then quietly, steadily, he spoke. I want the public to know that disagreement doesn't make us enemies. The room froze. No scribbling. No whispering. Just listening. We don't strengthen our country by shouting the loudest, he continued. We strengthen it by asking questions, giving answers, and respecting each other enough to separate facts from assumptions. He clasped his hands again, not as a defensive gesture, but as someone grounded himself in what mattered. Politics shouldn't be a performance. It should be a conversation. A hard one sometimes, but always a conversation. He paused, letting the idea breathe. Now, some folks will criticize me. So will support me. That's democracy. But whether I'm right or wrong on an issue, I promise you this. He raised one hand slightly, not dramatically, but with sincerity. I'll always explain why. I'll always listen. And I'll always be willing to learn. A soft murmur filled the room. Not disagreement, but a warm, quiet acknowledgement. Kennedy stepped back to the podium for the last time that afternoon. His voice softened even more, not with weakness, but with conviction. My job isn't to win arguments, he said. My job is to help the public understand what's happening. Clearly, honestly, and without turning every moment into a battlefield. The young reporter nodded slowly, almost respectfully, before lowering his hand. And finally, Kennedy added, to the folks watching at home, if you ever feel confused about something I support, ask. Don't assume. Don't let noise drown out the truth. I'll always give you an answer. Might not be the answer you want, but it'll be the truth as I understand it. With that, he gathered his papers, not hurriedly, but with the same unbroken calm he carried through the entire event. The moderator stepped forward. That concludes today's briefing. But he didn't get to finish, because for the first time in the entire press conference, something unexpected happened. The reporters, every one of them, stood, not clapping, not cheering, just standing in a quiet, united gesture of respect rarely seen in Washington. Not because Kennedy destroyed anyone, not because he outsmarted them, not because he won, but because he led, calmly, honestly, fully, as he walked out, briefcase in hand and shoulders steady. The cameras followed him, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. He gave one final wave to the room. Y'all take care now, he said softly, and the doors closed behind him. Leaving the press room was something they didn't expect to find that day. Clarity, respect, and the rare feeling that, for once, everyone had actually listened.